and a pleasant good evening to you, or good morning in Australia and New Zealand, and good evening in the East Coast, and good afternoon on the West Coast. Let me introduce myself. I'm Zev Yaroslavsky, and on behalf of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, who is traveling tonight in the Arctic, and myself, I am pleased to welcome you to today's America at a Crossroads program. Tonight is our 9th Israel in Crisis program since October 7th. As our audience is aware, this week we have 2 programs. Tonight we are being joined by Yossi Klein Halevi, and more about him in a moment. In our regularly scheduled program this Wednesday, March 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific, our guest will be the Atlantic's David Frum in conversation with Warren Olney, who will discuss politics, elections, wars, and America's standing in the world. The following Wednesday, March 20th at 5 p.m. Pacific, please join us for another important and timely program as we welcome CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. He will be in conversation with Larry Mantle on the topic Anti-Semitism, Hate, and Bigotry in America Today, an update. And we have an important announcement to make this evening. Ehud Olmert, who served as Israel's 12th prime minister from 2006 to 2009 and as mayor of Jerusalem from 1993 to 2003, among other positions he held, has accepted our invitation to be our guest on Sunday, March 24th, Sunday, March 24th at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time. Ehud has been outspoken on the Israel-Gaza crisis in recent weeks, and his appearance will be timely and enlightening. Janice will send the registration link on Wednesday, so don't worry if you don't receive it before then. But please register for March 24th, a Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific. To our international audience, please take note that the United States, in its infinite wisdom, is now on daylight savings time. That is to say, we moved our clocks forward 1 hour this past weekend. So if you haven't moved your clock, please be sure your time calculation takes into account our time change. Finally, hold the date for our 4th anniversary program on Wednesday, March 27th at 5 p.m. Pacific, as we welcome back Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post. Jennifer was our very first America at a Crossroads guest, and she has joined us each year on our program's anniversary for a program entitled America Then and Now, Where Are We Headed? Our moderator will be Warren Olney. Turning to tonight's program, Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative together with Abdullah Antepli of Duke University. He is the author of several best-selling books and thought-provoking books on Israel-Arab relations, and his commentary and reflections on the Israel-Gaza crisis, including several appearances on this program, have been profound. Yossi is a consequential thought leader. When he speaks, his audiences listen. On a personal note, Yossi and I go back to the late 1960s and 1970s when we were both activists in the struggle to free Soviet Jewry. It's truly a privilege to introduce him this evening. And Yossi will be in conversation with Patt Morrison, who is an author, writer, and columnist at the Los Angeles Times, where she has been awarded a share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. She has also received every possible honor in the broadcast journalism world, including 6 Emmys and a dozen Golden Mics. Pat, it's all yours.
Thank you, Zev. Thank you to everyone for watching this evening as we try to bring ourselves up to date on what is clearly the biggest story going on right now, and to clarify a lot of what's going on. Yossi Klein Halevi is my guest. He's asked me to call him Yossi, and so I will. Thank you so much for being here again. Well, since we're in Hollywood, within a few miles, I think we have to start with something that's taken over social media a little bit today, which are the remarks by Jonathan Glazer, who won the Oscar for Best International Feature Film for Zone of Interest about the Holocaust. Let me read what he said in his acceptance speech. He said, "All our choices were made to reflect and confront us in the present, not to say, look what they did then, rather look what we do now. Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. whether the victims of October the 7th in Israel or the ongoing attack on Gaza, all the victims of this dehumanization. How do we resist? Now, a little later, I want to talk about a subject you've delved into, which is the divergence of opinion between diaspora Israelis and Israelis in Israel. But first, I want your sense of what that meant and what it signified at this moment in this internationally repercussive crisis.
The statement was outrageous in so many ways that it's hard to know where to begin. Maybe the place to begin is to say that his intention was to condemn the misuse, the political abuse of the Holocaust by people supporting this war. And he did so through an act of political abuse of the Holocaust, except for the other side. It was a crass manipulation of Holocaust memory. And for me, what the moment represented, and I have to tell you, Pat, it ruined my day. I've been in a state all day about this. As someone who grew up in a survivor family, my feeling is that this is the culminating moment of the Holocaust as a weapon against the Jews, and to have a Jewish filmmaker use a film about Auschwitz to make a point about the Gaza war, not about the return of global anti-Semitism, not about the genocidal assault of October 7th. And yes, he mentioned October 7th in passing. He covered himself. But it was clear that the weight of his remarks, the passion of his remarks were focused on Israel's response to October 7th. I felt violated, and I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed for him, and I felt ashamed for us as a people that it's come to this, that this is what we're producing at this moment in our history. And I just didn't know how to respond. I sat down, I started writing an article, and all that came out was rage.
A lot of people in that illustrious audience were also wearing red ceasefire pins as well.
Yeah. There was one person spotted wearing a yellow ribbon for the hostages. This is in an industry that Dave Chappelle said is controlled by the Jews. Well, if this is the best that the Jews can do, then I think we'd be better off not having so many Jews in Hollywood.
And do I misremember that the first political Oscar acceptance speech that I can recall was Vanessa Redgrave speaking about the Palestinians like 40 years ago?
Yeah, that's what I recall as well. And so here we are 40 years later, except it's not Vanessa Redgrave, who was a member of some Trotskyite faction, but a seemingly normative Jew who cared passionately enough about the Holocaust to devote himself to a film, to making a film about it. And this is what he, in the end, this is what he's going to be remembered for this speech and for this distortion. And just one last thing,
Sure,
which is that I feel that this is a moment, and I don't only mean specifically what happened at the Oscars, but since October 7th, where Israel is being accused of genocide, and in some ways this is the ultimate Jewish nightmare, where we are subjected to a kind of a pre-enactment of Hamas's genocidal vision, and then we find ourselves on trial, metaphorically and also literally, in The Hague, for the accusation of committing genocide. And so there's something about what this moment means that I think requires of the Jewish community a reevaluation of Holocaust education, Holocaust commemoration, because one of the main purposes of the tremendous amount of resources that the Jewish community has poured into Holocaust commemoration and education has been to keep the Jews safe. That was really one of the main goals, to help us to strengthen our immune system against genocidal anti-Semitism. And one of the ways in which Holocaust education played out was to become to use the Holocaust as a kind of a metaphor for racism generally. And that made a certain sense in the American context, except that what we're seeing now is that the end result of using the Holocaust as a metaphor without emphasizing the uniqueness of anti-Semitism, which works differently from anti-Semitism, which works differently from racism. Anti-Semitism is turning the Jew into the symbol of whatever a given society views as its worst offenses. And so we're now at a time in history where the worst offense is racism. And so, of course, the Jewish state, is now the arch representative of racism. And we are now being accused of perpetrating another Holocaust. And that's what Jonathan Glazer did last night. Not explicitly, but clearly that was the implication. And so we're the new Nazis. And so I think this is a moment where we need to rethink some of the basic premises of Holocaust education. And where did we go wrong? How did we allow ourselves to be so vulnerable that the Holocaust would become one of the main weapons being used to delegitimize the Jews?
Let's talk about President Biden and the State of the Union, where he really rebuked Netanyahu, if not explicitly, then implicitly. He said he's going to build that floating seaport to help deliver aid to Gaza. There's already been sort of bundles for Gaza, airlift Gazas taken in. The food supplies, the questions about feeding children, feeding people in Gaza has taken a big turn, and a disputatious one. And the White House has warned Israel against that planned ground attack on Rafah. And later in the week, the president used the term red line, that may in fact be a red line. We don't know what lies on the other side of that red line, but clearly that is where he thinks has been taken too far.
So look, the context in which I approach that question is that there are two ways of critiquing Israel's war. The first, which has been Biden's approach, is that Israel is fighting a just war, but not always justly. And friends of Israel need to critique Israel when it's not fighting a just war justly. The second way in which Israel and the Gaza war has been critiqued is that the war is inherently illegitimate because Israel itself is illegitimate. Israel is a criminal state. It has, because of the occupation, because we're a colonialist implant, we have no right effectively to defend ourselves. Hamas is an expression of understandable resistance to occupation, and which by the way, Jonathan Glazer kind of opened the door to that as well by speaking about the occupation in the context of October 7th, when Hamas had no intention of undoing the occupation of 1967. Hamas's goal was undoing the creation of Israel. And so my approach to Biden is I really appreciate your critique of Israel as coming from a place of deep friendship. You have affirmed this war as a just war, and we in Israel don't always see what you see abroad, and we are so caught up in the war. We're so traumatized. We're so determined to restore Israeli deterrence and bring down the Hamas regime, that we don't always see what this war looks like to outsiders. And so I appreciate that critique. It doesn't oblige me, though, to agree with every facet of Biden's assessment of how we're fighting this war. I think that in some ways he exaggerated certainly when he said that the casualty figures are over the top. I don't know what that means. One dead child is over the top. What's the number? What's the cutoff point? If you look at the ways in which the Gaza casualties have been distorted and misused against Israel, it begins with the uncritical adoption of Hamas's casualty figures.
Yeah.
30,000. Now, 30,000 who? Are they all women and children? There were no Hamas fighters in that 30,000. Israel says we've killed up to 14,000 Hamas fighters. Now, if that's the case, then the proportion of the ratio of civilians to fighters is well within the norm of other conflicts. And so
I'm sorry.
no. So what does over the top mean? And so I feel that the president inadvertently has helped delegitimize this war, even as he's been one of our most stalwart supporters. And I'm very careful in my criticism of him. I certainly prefer him to a leader than Netanyahu. I would prefer him as Prime Minister of Israel to Netanyahu, but for that matter, I'd prefer almost anyone. So,
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think Biden, the sense from Biden and from a lot of people in this country, Jews and non-Jews, is that Biden, in saying, I am never going to leave Israel, is interested in pulling Israel back from a precipice. You talk about perceptions, internal and external, and how different they may be. But there's a lot of concern in Israel as well, as you see by the demonstrations against Netanyahu and the way he's pursuing this war. And you've written about the different attitudes between diaspora Israelis and Israelis in Israel. And so
diaspora Jews.
Right. So at what point is everybody kind of rooting for Israel to do the right thing that may look different from one point of view to another point of view?
Well, Pat, I think we need to make a distinction between opposing Netanyahu and this government and opposing the war. The overwhelming majority of Israelis support this war and want to see Netanyahu gone. There's something like 15% of Israelis want Netanyahu to continue after the war is over. 15%. And yet something like 90% of Israelis support the war. 70 to 75% of Israelis want us to go into Rafah. As do I. I believe that if that means destroying Hamas, if that's the final move, then we need to go into Rafah, provided that we have in place a credible plan for minimizing civilian casualties. But I believe that we're going to have to go into Rafah. And so, and I spent the last year out on the streets demonstrating against this government every week, every Saturday night, sometimes more than once a week. And I was passionately involved with the democracy movement. And yet I support this war as a necessary evil. This is Israel's most brutal war and one of Israel's most necessary wars. And many of us, Israeli liberals, hold that tension in place. And I'm very upset at the calls for ceasefire that are growing among American Jews. I think it's a major mistake. I understand where that's coming from, but if we leave the Hamas regime in power on our border, the regime that did October 7th, then we're sending a signal to the Middle East that we no longer have the ability to adequately defend ourselves.
Let's put the question to, let me interrupt you. And we want to put the question to our audience that you can put your questions to Yossi. If you will put them in the Q&A, then we will try to get to them a little later in the program. So Yossi, just today, the CNN was talking about a U.S. intel assessment about Netanyahu's viability as a leader may be in jeopardy. This is certainly something, as you say, that people have been demonstrating for, certainly about, as something separate from the war. Is it conceivable that there is a war without Netanyahu?
I think Netanyahu is turning out to be one of the great liabilities of this war. I would flip the question around and say, is it possible for Israel to really defeat Hamas as long as Netanyahu and his government is in power? Because this is a government that has no moral credibility. And one of the ironies here is that the people actually running this war, and I'm speaking about the war cabinet, which is a very small group, are by and large credible. They're militarily credible and morally credible. Netanyahu is the one exception in that group. But Defense Minister Gallant, certainly Benny Gantz, the leading opposition figure who joined the war cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot, these are substantial people. And the far right, whom Netanyahu has scandalously brought into the heart of government, have nevertheless been kept out of the war cabinet. This is something really important for people abroad to understand, that those who are actually making the day-to-day decisions about this war are people I trust, are both, again, morally and militarily credible. And but the irony is that the perception abroad is that it's Netanyahu and his disastrous far-right ultra-Orthodox government which is calling the shots here, and that's not true.
So who, if Netanyahu were to go, if he were to resign or to be forced to resign, would anything change then? And if that's the case, why get rid of him? Why bother making him the argument?
Well, there would be new elections. And one reason Netanyahu has to go is that the perception abroad is that this is Netanyahu's war. And to have this war identified so strongly with someone who has lost all moral credibility is a disaster for the war itself. Now, this is not Netanyahu's war. This is my war. This is the war of the people of Israel. We support this war. You know, Netanyahu said on Fox News yesterday, he was pushing back against Biden, and he says, the people of Israel agree with my policies. And I heard that, and I said, they're not your policies. This is our policies. This is our response to October 7th. But as long as this war is perceived to be Netanyahu's war, then certainly Biden is going to continue to lose patience with us. And Kamala Harris the other day said that you have to make a distinction between the government of Israel and the people of Israel. And I think that that's true up to a point. If she means a distinction between how this war is being fought, I think that's a false dichotomy, because, again, the overwhelming majority of Israelis support this war and support the way the war is being fought.
Well, let me bring it.
Proves that.
Let me bring in some questions now from some of our viewers. Here's one. And apart from the numbers and the numbers and the source of the numbers of the casualties, how do we, caring American Jews who love Israel, reconcile that love with the moral dislike of what Israel is doing to the innocent? As the phrase from the 60s in Vietnam was collateral damage.
The question of civilian casualties is inherent in an asymmetrical war, generally. whether it was against ISIS or to bring down Saddam Hussein. When you're fighting a force that is embedded in a civilian population, the results are going to be unbearable. Now, Israel has fought many rounds against Hamas, and we always pulled our punches. And the reason for that was that we essentially played by Hamas's rules, which is that Hamas has immunity when it hides in mosques and schools and hospitals. After October 7th, we changed the ground rules. We said no more immunity. We are not allowing Hamas to determine the rules of the game here. And as a result of that, the rules of engagement by the IDF were loosened. It's not as tight as it was, and inevitably we've seen a rise in civilian casualties and in suffering, in terrible suffering in Gaza. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is what is this war? For almost every Israeli Jew, this war is analogous to World War II. For many Americans, including many American Jews, this war increasingly resembles Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it's being perceived as a war that's out of control, where it's lost its moral legitimacy. That's not how we perceive this here. And when I say we, I mean almost wall to wall, from moderate left to center to right. This war is seen in the framework of an essential conflict that will determine Israel's long-term existence. And when you're fighting an existential war, you have no choice. Now, when I say this is an existential war, I don't mean that if we fail to bring Hamas down, Israel will risk being destroyed immediately. That's not what's at stake. It's more a question of a long-term process. If we fail to bring down Hamas after October 7th, the message we are conveying to the Middle East is we no longer have it in us. And the old Israel is gone. And that's going to have long-term consequences. So the fact that we see this war in World War II categories changes the way that we relate to the question of civilian casualties. And if you see this war as through the framework of Afghanistan, then you're going to reach very different conclusions.
Here's a question. Some Israelis believe that the army has no real plan or ability to rid Israel of Hamas. Maybe that means Gaza. Therefore, they don't see the value of continuing the war. So the question is, can you explain why not a ceasefire, especially with the hostages? Because there have been hostage negotiations before. It seems like the easiest point of entry into this moment.
Yeah, so there are two issues here. One is the question of do we have a plan, and the other is the fate of the hostages. As far as the question of do we have a plan, the army does have a plan. The government hasn't adopted it. The problem is not the army, it's the government. And it's a disaster that we are fighting this war without a credible morning after blueprint. And that's another reason why this government has to go. And so that's one issue. In terms of the hostages, it's a very complicated question, because there are two non-negotiable values that are conflicting here, two essential elements of the Israeli ethos. The first is the responsibility that we have for our fellow Israelis, and that has really helped define Israeli solidarity. And in fact, it's defined Jewish solidarity for thousands of years. And the second essential value at play here is self-defense. We don't allow a genocidal regime that already proved its capacity for genocide to continue existing on our border. Now, to have to make a decision between which of those two values takes priority is tearing us apart. And I don't mean tearing the society apart. It's tearing each of us apart. It's tearing me apart from within. And I don't know where I stand on that issue. Sometimes I prioritize the hostages. Sometimes I say, you know, we've already lost so many people. We have to bring Hamas down. But I don't feel definitively either way, and I think that that's true for many Israelis.
There's also a question about the getting more food, medicine, aid into the civilian population in Gaza. We've seen footage in the last week or so of Israeli settlers actively trying to stop trucks taking supplies into Gaza. And this question is, why don't we see the Israeli public taking a stronger position on getting more food and medicine into the civilian population in Gaza?
Great question. It's my question too. Just one correction. It's not settlers who are trying to stop the trucks. It's actually families of hostages.
Oh, thank you.
And that's really an expression of their desperation. And they have a powerful argument. They say, why are we taking care of civilians in Gaza when our families are being held by Hamas? I don't think you can starve Gaza into submission. That was the impulse in Israel the first days after October 7th, to lay a kind of a medieval siege of Gaza and force them into submission by not allowing any food in. You can't do that. You can't do that in this world today. In terms of the Israeli public, most Israelis do not feel a sense of anguish about what's happening in Gaza. And I say that with a certain amount of anguish. I understand it emotionally. I don't understand it intellectually. I understand it emotionally because I feel such rage that it's hard to I have to force myself to care about the people of Gaza. And I'm speaking to you very, very honestly. And that's something that I'm ashamed of and I struggle with, but that's the truth. Many Israelis are not struggling. They've simply given in to that sense of pure rage. And that's a very dangerous place to be in. So
Isn't that what happens in wartime when
absolutely.
you feel existential, is that you can ignore or even demonize the population of the people of the country that you're fighting collaterally again?
It's true, but we don't have that luxury for several reasons. One is because we are under a microscope by the international community. Every move, every clip that soldiers make in Gaza somehow gets amplified and put on social media and is one more weapon against us. Another reason why we don't have that luxury is that this isn't America fighting Germany. We're fighting our next door neighbors. No one's going away when this war is over. And so how we all emerge from the ruins of this war is going to shape our relationship for many years to come. So without even getting into the moral questions, a question of how should the Jewish people fight its wars, I appreciate that line of argument. Emotionally, it's hard for me to be there right now. But in practical terms, I'm going to have to live next door to the people of Gaza, and I live with the Palestinians. I live with Palestinians next door in the West Bank. I live with Palestinian citizens of Israel literally in my building in Jerusalem. My building is half Arab Israeli, half Jewish Israeli. And so how will my relationship with my neighbors be shaped really will in large part be determined by the outcome of this war. And I mean that in two ways. It will be determined by our moral conduct. It will also be determined by whether we destroy Hamas or leave Hamas in power. If we leave Hamas in power, that will also complicate our relationships with our neighbors, because we will be perceived as being dangerously weak.
We have a question, and forgive my little peanut gallery that you heard from just a minute ago. What fraction of Israelis' population do you think supports a two-state solution now?
Very small, very small. 30%. And look, in principle, I'm part of that 30%, but I'm very, very cautious. I would say that we don't know after October 7th what a future Palestinian state will look like. We don't know what its borders should be. After every Palestinian failure, and October 7th, I believe, will turn out to be an historic disaster for the Palestinians. Every failure results in a shrinking map of a possible Palestinian state. Look at the trajectory going back to the first partition plan of 1937. The map always gets smaller. That's one piece of this. And the second is that after October 7th, there is no way that Israelis, even those of us who support a two-state solution, will conceive of a Palestinian state in the near future. It must be very, very gradual. What I want to see is for Israeli policy to begin turning away from the road we're on now, which is creating effectively a binational Palestinian-Israeli state, which I think is a disaster, moving us slowly, carefully in the direction of a possible two-state solution. Now, I'm using as many caveats as I can. That when Biden speaks about a Palestinian state, he's making a mistake, a tactical mistake, because Israelis right now are incapable of hearing that argument. I believe that we will be able to return to a two-state solution, not now, but sometime after this war ends. And
we're entering the month of Ramadan, which itself is going to be fraught with a lot of questions and very delicate matters, including, for example, the question of limiting the number of Palestinians who get to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The proposal I heard of is that men over 55 would be allowed, women over 50. So there's no ceasefire for Ramadan, which seemed to be something that Biden was alluding to in his remarks of last week. What are your fears? What are your maybe hopes about Ramadan, about what may come out on the other end of it in terms of things that may be possible and things that may simply not be doable at all?
Right. Well, the attempt to limit Palestinian pilgrimage to Al-Aqsa was voted down by the war cabinet. The initiative came from Ben Gvir, who is scandalously the far right thug, let's not mince words, who Netanyahu placed in charge of the police. He's the Minister of Internal Security. Not the least of Netanyahu's multiple offenses, crimes against Israel. What worries me about Ramadan is that Ben Gvir is in charge of the police. Last night was the first night of Ramadan, and we saw Ben Gvir's commands to the police resulting in police brutality on the Temple Mount. The police in previous years was always extremely careful on Ramadan. We now have a different factor, and so my worry is that Ben Gvir could, God forbid, set the region on fire, And I think that that's one of his goals, frankly.
So provocation?
I think Ben-Gvir dreams of using the Temple Mount as a way of forcing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to a head. And if that means a confrontation with the entire Muslim world, I think he's okay with that. So we have someone who is a pyromaniac, really, in charge of the police at one of the most delicate moments in the history of this conflict. It's a very, very dangerous situation. Again,
You have a question.
the war cabinet is controlling as much as it can, is controlling the situation. They're the ones who are determining what happens on the Temple Mount, but Ben-Gvir is in charge of the police. So
Frank has a question. If all the hostages were returned, would Israel agree to a permanent ceasefire?
no, certainly not. There are two goals here: the return of the hostages and bringing down the Hamas regime. We're serious about that goal. Bringing down Hamas is not, from my point of view, is not a luxury. That is a precondition for restoring the credibility of Israeli military deterrence.
Claude wants to know about the world's perception of this war, but he said, given that this is a hope that has no chance of being achieved, that the world would share your vision, what's the smart thing to do?
Part of me feels that we need to take a deep breath and accept the fact that we're going to be effectively a pariah state for the near future. We've been in similar situations before, perhaps not as extreme as this, but we have known situations in the past where we were effectively an outcast state. I feel that the goal of bringing this regime down is important enough to Israel's future that we may need to risk a certain amount of ostracism.
So that would, but getting rid of Netanyahu would help to mitigate, you think, some of the world's attitudes?
Yes, I think it would. It's a little late. It's impressions have already been set for many people, set in stone about what this war is and what Israel is. But for our friends, I don't believe it's too late. And I'm thinking in particular of the U.S. and of this administration. That in some ways that's really the main priority, is making sure that we don't profoundly alienate the Biden administration.
The question from Pia is a question that we've heard since the beginning of this. What does winning look like?
Well, I think that it's first of all realizing that Hamas, in one form or another, is here to stay, just as ISIS is here to stay. But winning for me means that Hamas will no longer have the capacity to govern anywhere. Hamas will return to what it was before 2007, which is a powerful terror group with deep support in the Palestinian population, but not capable of actually governing any territory.
The question from, I don't see a name here. It says, you support Israel taking the potentially disastrous step of going into Rafah because it's necessary to finish off Hamas, but we're hearing that Hamas has already started re-emerging in the north. What if it's actually impossible to really finish off Hamas? You just alluded to that, but the sense that, is it whack-a-mole, or is there even any sense that if there were elections in Gaza, that Hamas would not be re-elected, some version of Hamas?
Look, it's a really important question, and we're all speculating. My sense is that Hamas can be brought to the point where it will be reduced to rear guard guerrilla action, as we're seeing in the north, but that Hamas will not be able to reconstitute itself as a governing authority. And so that's the goal of this war. What does it mean to in terms of support for Hamas among the Palestinians? You know, we were told that this war will have the effect of radicalizing a new generation of Palestinians. That may well be the outcome, but there is an alternative scenario, which is the scenario of 1945 Germany. And that is that after such devastation, the Palestinians, some Palestinians, begin asking the subversive question of maybe we need to find a different way. Why is it that every time we strike a devastating blow against Israel, it backfires on us? And we celebrated October 7th as a tremendous victory, and it turned out on October 8th that it was an illusion. So that could have an effect. We are hearing reports, sporadic reports, of demonstrations against Hamas. And we know that there has been opposition to Hamas. Would that opposition be emboldened the more Hamas is weakened? That's one scenario. I don't discount the other scenario of Hamas's popularity being strengthened. I would like to think, though, that there will be an outbreak of sobriety in Palestinian society as a result of this disaster.
A question about how long Benny Gantz would stay in the war cabinet and the purpose and anything achieved from his trip to the UK.
Look, you know, I personally am not a big Benny Gantz fan. I'm actually in Yair Lapid's camp. I think he was a terrific prime minister for 3 seconds. And I think he would make I think he would really make a very good prime minister. And I think he's a much better and in fact stronger man, even though that's not the perception among many Israelis, than Benny Gantz. Nevertheless, I appreciate the fact that there was a kind of a division of labor between Lapid and Gantz, where Gantz entered the government and was able to ensure from within that this war would not spin out of control, that this would not in fact turn into Netanyahu's war. And that was really essential for our ability to stay united as a society around this war. It was really the presence of Gantz and Eisenkot in the government that certainly restored my faith in the credibility of this war. Just in terms of how long he should stay, and in terms of how long he should stay in, I have two possible measures. One is he needs to stay in long enough for us to resolve Rafah. And the other is he needs to stay in long enough for us to resolve the hostage crisis. Now, does that mean both? He needs to stay in until both of these issues are resolved? I haven't worked that out. I don't know, but those are the parameters. And I think that it's still not yet time for him to leave, although that time may be approaching.
Mina has a question, which I think a lot of people ask themselves, just simply, why aren't supplies getting to the people of Gaza? It can't be quantity. Is it logistics? I mean, this seems like such an easy PR battle for Israel to help itself and not to have self-inflicted wounds.
Look, I think that Israel should have been airlifting food. I think we should have taken that on and not wait for Biden to initiate that. In terms of why more food isn't reaching Gaza, I forget what the number of how many trucks have been admitted in the last month.
It was just 100 or so today, and they're saying 300 a day is optimal.
And so it is it's a substantial number of trucks that are coming in. My understanding is that Hamas is commandeering a fair amount of this aid. I don't think that explains all of the problems, but that's certainly part of the mix.
We've also, well, in 10 months' time, we're going to have an inauguration in Washington, D.C. It will either be the beginning of a second term for Biden, one supposes, or that Donald Trump, the presumed Republican nominee, will be sworn in again, which obviously Netanyahu would like to have Trump back in office. But what happens? What's the scenario if each of these men becomes president or president again?
Well, I wonder if Biden, in a second term, might feel less political pressure, might be able to actually firm up his support for Israel. I think his support for Israel has been remarkable, even though I do sense I think there's been a weakening in the last weeks, which I attribute as much to election pressures as I do to his frustration with Netanyahu. In terms of Trump, I think Trump too is going to be very different for America as well. I think that the threat that so many of us feared in Trump won, and which didn't fully materialize because of his incompetence, the chaos of his administration, all kinds of other reasons. I think Trump too is going to be really focused on vengeance. And Trump too for Israel is not going to be Trump one. He's I think the isolationist streak within the Republican Party, the Tucker Carlson camp is on the ascendancy.
Even apropos of Israel?
Yeah, I do. I fear that. And I think that we are not going to see the open, the blank check that we received from Trump in the first term. I think it's going to look very different.
Sharon has a question about essentially the ripple effect, and we've just seen with the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. Her question is, where is Hezbollah and other Iran proxies in this accounting? What are the odds of a northern front being escalated and the ripple effect on what's going on with Gaza and Israel?
Well, I really appreciate the question because it places the Israeli-Hamas war in the context that Israelis are experiencing it, which is this is not just the Israeli-Hamas war. This is, I would call it the Israeli-Iranian war. The Hamas war is the first stage. This war may very well expand to the north, and it may expand to the south, to the Houthis, and to Syria. This could turn into a multi-front regional war. And frankly, I don't see how we can really avoid a military confrontation with Hezbollah, which will not be like anything we've experienced in any of our wars. It will be a nightmare.
You think it's inevitable?
I do think it's inevitable.
Oof.
Very simple reason. We have tens of thousands of internal refugees, Israelis who have fled their homes in the north, on the northern border and the southern border. And Israelis in the southern border are beginning tentatively to return home. They are not returning home in the northern border. And as long as Hezbollah is sitting literally right on the border, there will be a fear, a justifiable fear, of another October 7th. Israelis will not go back to their homes if Hezbollah is sitting on the border. You can go up to Metula, which is the northernmost point in Israel, and sit in someone's living room in Metula and look out and see a Hezbollah flag within easy distance. And so there is this sense that if we don't push these genocidal entities away from our border, the country is going to shrink. Israel is going to become non-viable in large parts of our territory. And given the fact that this is a small country to begin with, I think that we're really looking, again, I would define this as existential. The ability of Israelis to live anywhere they want within the state of Israel is an existential issue for us.
As we're running out of time, I wonder if you can give us a very short answer to Deanne's question, and being aware of the sensitivity from the Holocaust of what happens to Jewish bodies and how the dreadful nature of it. Her question is, why doesn't Israel release some of the horrific video of October 7th as a counter to what we're hearing from other sources on the opposite side?
I haven't seen the 43-minute film that Israel has made. I understand that it's powerful. There is a long-standing Israeli policy of honoring the dead, of respecting the privacy of the families. And I don't know how much that's in play now, but I think that the footage that is out there, from what I've heard from people who have seen it, is powerful enough. And if that hasn't succeeded in turning people around, then I don't know. I think we're in a place of a kind of version of Holocaust denial, where we're seeing widespread October 7th denial, and the simply insane phenomenon of ripping down the posters of the hostages, especially on campuses, is itself a form of an expression of denial. Of we can't look at their faces. We can't acknowledge that the humanity of Israelis. We can't acknowledge the trauma of Israelis. So there's such a deep set denialism that we're up against here, that that no amount of shock footage would work against that.
Yossi, we have a minute, and we'll always use that minute for one hopeful thought to leave our audience with. Is there one you can deliver to us?
Oh, Netanyahu is going down. Now, it's true that I've been saying this for far too long, but I do think he's going down. I urge everyone to pay close attention to March 31st. That's the date when the Knesset will have to decide whether to renew or allow to lapse the temporary bill exempting all ultra-Orthodox from military service. If this government fails to renew that bill, and I believe there's going to be a revolt within the Likud, possibly within the two far-right parties that are in the government, I think that if that temporary bill is not renewed, the ultra-Orthodox parties will bring this government down. And so pray for the ultra-Orthodox, pray for their steadfastness in holding on to their principles, so that they will bring this government down to make a point, and that this government will really come crashing on this disastrous coalition that has brought us ruin internally and ruin externally.
Well, Yossi, Klein, Halevi, I think people will be marking their calendars right now to see and to watch and to wait, and then to hear from you, for you to come back to give us a further analysis of what has happened. Always happy to see you. You can follow him on social media and read his book. And we're always happy for you to see and support these programs. On Wednesday, we'll have the political guru David Frum talking with Warren Olney. As you can see, the upcoming schedule events on the calendar there. And of course, we will add more as necessary and as guests become available. as the news dictates and demands. So thank you to all of you who support and watch these programs. They're so vital in these times, and we have every intention of keeping them going as long as you would like to watch them. I'm Pat Morrison. Thank you for being with us this evening.